Hello and welcome to today's webinar on using the resources at the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center in your family history research. My name is Ginevra Morse, Vice President of Education and Programming at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be your moderator for today's program. This program is brought to you by the Brew Family Learning Center. American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. I do want to note that we are still broadcasting from our homes to your home with various limitations and distractions. We do apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and we thank you for your patience. If we were to lose connection, not to worry, you will still have access to a full recording of this session on our website and our YouTube channel. So our presenter today is Lindsay Sprechman Murphy. Lindsay joined the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center at New England Historic Genealogical Society in August of 2015. As Senior Archivist, Lindsay manages a wide variety of archival work, including the accessioning, processing, and cataloging of collections, digitization projects, and reference requests. She received a BA in History from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and a Master's in Library and Information Science with a concentration in Archives Management from Simmons College. She is a member of the Society of American Archivists and New England Archivists. So the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center at NEHGS preserves the histories of Jewish families and institutions in New England and beyond. The JHC holds more than 2 million records in its archives and more than 600,000 searchable documents in its digital collections. Over the next hour or so, we will learn more about these collections, resources, and expertise at the JHC, and how these materials can be leveraged by family historians. At any point during the presentation, feel free to type your question into the panel to the right of your screen. We'll address those at the end. There is no syllabus or handout for this session, but we are recording this event, and starting tomorrow, you can freely go back and review any of the content from the presentation on our website as well as our YouTube channel. So if you missed something on today's first listen, not to worry, you can always go back and review the presentation later. All right, so without further ado, I will turn things over to Lindsay.
Hi all, and thanks so much for being here today. First, I figured I'd briefly go over the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center, who we are and what we do. The Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center at New England Historic Genealogical Society, which I'll just refer to as the JHC, is a destination for exploring and preserving the histories of Jewish families and institutions in New England and beyond. The JHC does this through our archival work, educational programs and events, and family history components. Although the JHC was established at NEHGS in 2015, the roots of the JHC go back even further, to 1892, the year that the American Jewish Historical Society was founded. AJHS is the oldest ethnic historical society in the country, with a national presence in New York City at the Center for Jewish History. So for all of you who still know us as the New England Archives of AJHS, we are now the JHC. Although our archives primarily focus on Boston and New England, we handle research requests nationally and internationally and focus on presenting local history stories in a national and global historical context. Even through our education and other programming, the cornerstone of everything we do is our archival collections. And this is what I'll be focusing on today. So what do our archives contain? Mainly, we collect 3 types of materials. First is institutional records, denoted by I or JHCI. And those are materials from congregations, community service organizations, Zionist groups, businesses, burial societies, and academic and cultural organizations. Next is personal papers, denoted by P or JHCP. And these are materials from individuals or families. And finally, newspapers. we have the runs of a number of local Jewish newspapers, which I'll talk about later. So as you can see here, our collections cover a variety of subjects, from immigration and the immigrant experience to anti-Semitism, to synagogue life, and to the labor movement, and much more. And geographically, they also cover various regions, including Boston, Massachusetts is North Shore, Western Massachusetts, and Greater New England as a whole. So how can our archival collections help you with your family research? There are a few ways, all of which I'll illustrate today throughout this presentation. First is they literally provide you with facts and figures, things that can really help you, especially if you're building a family tree or working on a genealogy project. In our archival collections, you can find out things like birth and death dates, birthplaces, maiden names, birth names, immigration years, immigration vessels, the names, dates, etc., family members, and so much more. Our collections can also tell your family's story, whatever story that may be. Your family's immigration story can be found in a case file from our Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society Boston Port records. The story of your family's involvement in Jewish life, clubs, aid societies, and more can be found in bulletins and photographs in our synagogue or organization records. And finally, some of you might be wondering why it might be useful to know about our collections if our collections don't actually mention your family, or if your family doesn't even have roots in Boston or Massachusetts. Well, archival collections add historical context to family research and genealogy. Perhaps your great-grandmother was a teenage girl in the late 1890s, and she had just immigrated to America. You may have all sorts of basic information, her birth date, her birthplace, etc. But what was her life like? Well, in our collections, we have, for example, the correspondence of Mary Anson, who herself was a teenager in the late 1890s, who wrote widely about her experiences as a new immigrant in America. What school was like, how it was to learn English, how she made friends, and more. So reading her papers, you can get a pretty good idea about what life may have been like for your great-grandmother during this time. You can use our archival collections, even if they're not actually from your own family, to understand what life may have been like for your family. Today, I'm going to focus on how you can use our materials, whether in person or online, in your family history research. You can access many of the resources I'll be talking about today by going to our website, jewishheritagecenter.org. One important way to see exactly what our archival collections contain and if they may help you in your family history research are our finding aids. Finding aids are guides or maps to archival collections. They are created by archivists to tell you, researchers, what is in the collection and where to locate materials within a collection. It's an aid to help you find information and materials, hence the term finding aids. Online, our finding aids are divided into two groups, personal papers and institutional records. When you see a finding aid you would like to review, you can select the name and an abstract will appear. The abstract tells you about what or who the papers are about and provides a link to view the actual finding aid should you want to see it. It's a good way to quickly assess whether a collection has the information you are looking for. So here's an example of a finding aid, the Sterling and Selesnik family papers. You can see it provides you with a scope and content note, which is an overview of what the collection contains, the dates of the collection, the languages in the collection, and any access or use restrictions. The finding aid will also provide you with a biographical or historical note, a note on extent, how big the collection is, a chronology of important events, and other important information. And our finding aids also have container lists, which list everything the collection contains in an organized fashion. The container list tells you what exactly is in the collection and where exactly in the collection you can find what you're looking for. For example, if you're interested in viewing the memoir, I Want My Children to Know, the finding aid tells you that it's in box 1, folder 2. On our site, you can also see a list of all of our finding aids. You can see here that there are 257 finding aids. And this page will show you the collection title, collection number, a brief overview of the collection, and the dates it covers. But a good thing about this site is that you can filter by certain subjects. Say, for example, you'd like to see all collections that are related to Lynn, Massachusetts. You can click on the subject and it will return all 28 of our collections that are related to Lynn. You could also do a keyword search to search a certain word or phrase in our collections. We also have digitized collections that can be accessed by you at home through our digital library and archives, which I'll just refer to as the DLA. The two collections that are most regularly accessed are the Boston Jewish Times and the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society Boston Port Records, both of which I'll talk about later. We have over 1.2 million documents digitized and approximately 800,000 available online for research. I am going to go into a little bit more detail about the DLA, but for an in-depth webinar about how to effectively use the DLA, I encourage you all to check out my colleague Sally Benny's webinar titled Navigating the Digital Library and Archives at AmericanAncestors.org, which is available on the American Ancestors website or on the YouTube channel. So here are the types of collections that are available on our DLA. You can see that some are single collections, like the Mary Antin Correspondence to Alfred Seeley Rowe, and others are groups of collections, like rabbinical, synagogue, and Jewish education papers. And if you click on one of those squares, you can see a list of all the collections in that theme that have been digitized and are available to view. So we do have a couple of collections on our DLA that you do not need a guest user account to access, but the majority of digitized collections do need one. NEHGS and JHC members already have access, and you can just log in with your member ID to view the materials. For all others, you will need to create a free guest user account using the link here, and then email our reference email, jhcreference@nehgs.org, with your username and the collections you wish to view. Once we give you access, we'll let you know, and you can use your guest user credentials to log in. So though these days it seems like everything is available online, that is not the case. We have millions and millions of individual documents in our archival collections. And though our goal is to get the majority of them digitized eventually, that takes time, money, labor, staff, and a lot of effort. So for non-digitized items, you can visit us. Though we often try to help people virtually, well, for small research projects, we can scan and email you materials. But for bigger projects, you can come visit us, get your hands on some of the archives, and do research yourself. We are by appointment only, and due to the current situation, we are closed for research appointments, but we're planning to make them available soon. So please check our website for details about that. Okay, so now that you've learned how to access our archival collections, I'm going to delve into what specific collections may be useful for you in researching your family history. The first collection is of Rabbi's papers. There are 3 main collections that may be useful to you. First is the Rabbi Ber Barakoff papers. He was the rabbi at Congregation Beth Israel in Malden, Massachusetts, from 1906 to 1939, and his collection contains 8 ledgers in which he recorded the 1,423 marriages he officiated. And here's an example of a page from the ledger. This one are marriages from 1912. So what do these marriage records tell you? They tell you the names of both the bride and groom, their addresses, their ages, their occupations, their places of birth, their parents' names, including mother's maiden names, their marriage number, if this was their first or second marriage, or if they were divorced and or widowed, and the date of the marriage. So let's take a closer look at a record. Here we can see that the couple is William Rosenfield and Fanny Watman. He lived at 41 Spring Street in Boston, and she lived at 40 Spring Street, so they were neighbors, presumably. He was 27, and his occupation was a jewelry maker. And she was 21, and she was a cape maker. They were both born in Russia. His parents are Samuel and Sarah Wyner, and her parents are Abraham and Gertrude Weinmaster. This is the first marriage for both, and they were married in Malden by the rabbi on September 12th, 1912 in this case. So obviously this is a great resource if this rabbi married someone you are researching. So how can you access these materials? The ledgers are completely digitized on our DLA, but they are not searchable or indexed. You would need to browse the collection, but they are in chronological order, so if you know about the date you're looking for, it wouldn't be too difficult to find. And the information is also available on JewishGen and Ancestry.com. And here they are indexed and searchable, but you can't view the images of the ledger. And of course, you'll also need memberships to JewishGen or Ancestry to search these databases. Next is the Rabbi Aaron Gorovitz papers. He was a rabbi at numerous small congregations in Boston, but was most notably the rabbi at Congregation Sons of Abraham in Roxbury in Boston. His ledger contains 8 ledgers in which he recorded the 971 marriages he officiated. And here's an example of his ledger. This one is from 1930. The records tell pretty similar information to the ledgers of Rabbi Ber Barakoff, things like names, addresses, and occupations. But these records also include the birthplaces of the parents, which can be very useful. So here's the entry for the Stern-Kaplan marriage. The groom was David B. Stern. He lived at 19 Commonwealth Avenue in Boston. He was 30 and was white, and he was a physician, born in Russia. His father was Abraham Stern, who was born in Russia, and it's shortened here to Russ or RUS. And his mother, Bella Kaplan, was also born in Russia, and this was his first marriage. The bride was Frances Kaplan, and she lived at 129 Columbia Road in Dorchester. She was 25 and white and was a buyer. She was born in Boston, and her parents, Louis Kaplan and Mary Rubinovitz, were both born in Poland. And this is her first marriage. And you can see important dates here, including the date of marriage, which was August 26, 1930. Also very similar to the Bear-Barakoff collection, the records are completely digitized on our DLA, but aren't searchable or indexed, just browsable. They are also indexed and searchable on Jewish Gen and Ancestry, but you cannot view the images. And of course, you'll also need membership to those sites. Finally, there are the Rabbi Itzik Benkovitz papers. He was the rabbi at two Chelsea synagogues during his long career, Zemek Zedek and Sha'ari Zion, also known as the Orange Street Shul. His records contain 3 ledgers of the 610 marriages he officiated from 1922 to 1956. And his collection also contains a few gets or divorces from 1922 that are in Yiddish and have not yet been translated. And this is an example of an entry from 1924. So here, the information is pretty similar to the other rabbis' ledgers: names, addresses, ages, occupations, birthplaces, and so on. So let's take a closer look. Here is the Lannon and Dlugosch marriage. The groom was Harry H. Lannon, who was white and lived at 474 Dexter Street in Central Falls, Rhode Island. He was 29 and a merchant, and he was born in London, England. His father was Isaac, and his mother was Leah Ettinger, and this was his first marriage. The bride was Beatrice Dlugosch, who was white and lived at 37 Poplar Street in Chelsea. She was 24 and a homemaker and was born in Russia. Her father was Joseph, and her mother was Ida Wishnevetsky, and this was also her first marriage. And here you can see some dates, including the date of the ceremony, January 20th, 1924, and that they were married at the bride's residence in Chelsea. This collection is digitized, indexed, and searchable through the Chelsea MA Marriages by Rabbi Itzik Benkovitz 1922 to 1956 database, available on AmericanAncestors.com. You will need an NEHGS or JHC membership to access this database. So just to briefly show you how this works, here I've searched the last name Dlugosch, and here are the results. You'll see the index information and also the scan from the marriage ledger. We do have some other rabbis' papers that, while not as organized as the ledgers, may be of some help, especially if your relatives went to the synagogues that they served at. Albert I. Gordon was the rabbi at Temple Emmanuel in Newton. Avraham Friedman was the rabbi at Congregation Beth Israel in Bangor, Maine. And Jacob Friedman was served at Temple Beth El in Fall River, Temple Beth El in Chelsea, and Congregation Knesset Israel in Springfield. So I encourage you to look at the finding aids for each of these collections so you can see what they contain and if they may be helpful in your research. And just a note that moving forward, any collection that has an asterisk next to it means that it's digitized and is available online on our DLA. So the next type of collections are synagogue records. If your family were members of a certain synagogue, it's possible that there is useful information about them in that synagogue's records. So we have 38 synagogue collections in our archives, including 31 from Massachusetts, including those from Boston, the North Shore, and Western Massachusetts, 4 in Connecticut, and 2 in Rhode Island. And 15 of the collections have been digitized. The collections vary in size. Some are very small and some are quite large. And they also vary in the types of materials that they contain. And to view a list of all of our synagogue collections, check out our finding aids on our website. So what type of information can you find in synagogue records that may be helpful in your family history research? Synagogue bulletins and newsletters are great resources when researching family history. They record things like bar and bat mitzvahs, weddings, funerals, and other life cycle events. They also may detail your family's involvement in synagogue life. Photographs from synagogue records can also be a great resource, detailing your family's involvement, activities, and relationship with the synagogue. Sometimes they're also labeled and identify the individuals in the images, which is a huge plus. Meeting minutes from synagogue boards of trustees, boards of directors, sisterhoods, brotherhoods, synagogue committees, they all detail happenings at the synagogue. Here, for example, we see all the officers from the sisterhood from the synagogue, as well as other reports on other synagogue activities. And finally, synagogue souvenir and dedication books are another resources that were pretty common. In this case, this is for the 10th anniversary of Congregation Beth Hamidrash Hagadol, also known as the Crawford Street Shul in Roxbury. And this souvenir book actually published brief biographies of those involved in synagogue life. A question we get a lot is, my grandfather or grandmother was a member of a synagogue you have records on. Can you look and tell me his or her Hebrew name? Very rarely do the synagogue records we have in our archives record the Hebrew names of its members. In fact, for a large part of the 20th century, synagogues rarely even asked for Hebrew names on things like membership applications. So because of this, I encourage you all to ask around, write it down, and keep safe the names of Hebrew names of your family members, since they may be the only ones who actually have that information. Organizational records are also collections that can provide great research for you. I can't mention all of our organizational records since we have quite a lot, but here are some general categories of what we have. So we have women's organizations, things like local chapters of Hadassahs and United Order of True Sisters. We have fraternal societies, including chapters of B'nai B'rith and Independent Order of B'rith Abraham. JCCs, Jewish Community Centers, from places in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. Youth groups like YMHAs and YWHAs. Immigration aid societies, things like Landmannschaften, or immigrant benevolent organizations formed and usually named after the members' birthplaces. For example, we have the Meretz Relief Association, which was made up of members from Meretz, Lithuania. And of course, we also have labor organizations, including places like Workmen's Circle. And we also have some of the bigger organizations that you may have heard of, including the Bureau of Jewish Education, CJP, JCRC, Massachusetts Board of Rabbis, and the Synagogue Council of Massachusetts. So what can you find in organizational records that may be helpful to you? Meeting minutes, as mentioned before, record things like the membership, the officers, and happenings in the organization. Newsletters do the same, often in a more organized manner, and they often list birthdays, anniversaries, things like that. Membership records are also great resources. They often record things like names, addresses, dates of birth, military activity, academic history, and more. And various ephemera like pamphlets, brochures, programs, and more document all sorts of, in my opinion, really interesting activities your ancestor may have been involved with. And photographs similarly can, in a visual fashion, document your ancestors' organizational involvement. So for both synagogue and organizational records, what are the best ways to access them? For digitized collections, search the DLA. There are lots of synagogue and organization records on there. Most collections that are digitized have some type of transcription available, so you can usually do a search for an ancestor's name. And if it appears in the digitized documents, in, for example, a synagogue bulletin, it will show up. The transcriptions are mostly computer generated, so they're not perfect, but they often do the trick. And some collections, mostly ones that are mostly handwritten documents, are not searchable since we manually need to transcribe the text, but they are browsable. And for collections that are not yet digitized, you can email us for access. So just as a quick example about how you can access synagogue and organization records. So here in the DLA, I've searched the name Wallace Rubin, and 17 results have come up, mostly from Congregation Michigan Israel. And one of those 17 records, for example, is a birth announcement for his daughter, Anna D. And now to the one that may be the most useful to you, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, HIAS Boston Port Records, aka HIAS Boston. Chances are, if your ancestors immigrated through Boston between the late 1930s to the early 1950s, they're in these records. First off, a very brief overview of HIAS. HIAS worked to ensure access to religious services, kosher food, shelter, and social services in schools. They assisted with employment, locating disabled families, legal aid, lobbying, and naturalization. And they arranged for sponsors for those attempting to leave Europe, particularly during World War II, when immigration quotas made immigration very difficult. HIAS was, and still is, a national organization, but keep in mind that we only have the records for HIAS Boston, which was an autonomous organization from the national office and operated independently of them. So I talked about finding aids earlier, and here's the behemoth of finding aid for the HIAS Boston records. So using the finding aid, you can see a list of every single individual case file we have, and I'll explain what those are in a moment. But so we have listed, they're listed for the most part alphabetically, but keep in mind that we have over 14,000 case files. So it's a very, very long list. But you can see, for example, here that we have a case file on Brucha Axler. And on the finding aid, you can see that her file is in box 1, folder 2. And rather than looking through all the names, all 14,000 of them, you can search the collection using the search bar here. And here, for example, I searched for the name Perkins, and the 2 case files for anyone named Perkins came up. So what type of documents are in the HIAS Boston collection? So as mentioned, we have over 14,000 individual case files, which are files for each passenger and his or her family, if applicable, who received assistance through Highest Boston. Case files can contain just one document, or they can contain hundreds. It really varies. Generally, the case files range from the mid to late 1930s to the early 1950s, though there are plenty from before and after these years. And this is a box of case files and a peek into a folder of a case file. So what do these folders contain? They have correspondence, which is often between Highest Boston workers and individuals, either those looking to immigrate or those who were sponsoring immigrants. Naturalization applications and other similar types of forms are also common, and these forms often detail such information as names, maiden names, the names that were used when they arrived in the US, birthplaces, parents' names, other family members' names, the dates of arrival, the vessel name, and much more. They really can provide a lot of really good facts. And we often, very often in fact, have these types of forms, which are a little bit weird. They're essentially just the answers to the forms I just showed. And it does take some experience to figure out which questions these answers are for. So for example, in this case, the form is for Bessie Rubenstein. She was born as Bessie Goldstein on May 10th, 1895 to Jacob Goldstein and Rose Rose Srevenagora in Chechanova, Poland. She arrived in the US under the name Bessie Greenberg in March of 1905. And over here, you can see that Bessie Greenberg was her married name, her first married name. She was destined to Jacob Goldstein in Boston, and she immigrated with her mother, Rose, her sister, Scheindel, and her brother, Lieb. Her husband was Samuel, and there's up top here, there's a bunch of information about him. And they had 4 children, Sylvia, George, Edward, and Harold. So like I said, these forms can be very confusing, and if you encounter one of these forms in your research and you need help reading them, we're happy to help. Our staff here have definitely read through these documents hundreds of times, so we're pretty familiar with them. We also have affidavits and testimonies. Affidavits were used as guarantees that a sponsor, in this case, Alexander Strauss, would not let the immigrants, in this case, Leopold Herlinger and his family, become public charges or become a liability to the United States. And over here, testimonies were often used when necessary paperwork was missing. In this case, it seemed that the marriage certificate for Bluma Rivas and Shlomi Rudnick was either missing or was lost. So a friend, Morris Lubow, testified that he in fact witnessed the wedding back in Poland. And we also have tracers, which were documents used for finding relatives either in the United States or back in Europe. Oftentimes, those in Europe use them to find relatives in the US who could either sponsor them or send them financial help. Tracers were also used by worried relatives in the United States to seek relatives in Europe to see if they survived the war and what their general situation was like. And we also have things like telegrams. and passports and photographs. So as you can see, individual case files provide really useful information. The information is not necessarily just about those who immigrated, the ones whose names are on the case file. They provide great information about the sponsors, the immigrant's family back home, and more. So we also have 24,000 arrival cards. Arrival cards, as you can imagine, document the arrival of Jewish immigrants, both individuals and families, who passed through the port of Boston. They contain general biographical information on each person in the party, where the person was expected to live in the US, and what ship they arrived on. Keep in mind that these cards do not necessarily match up one-to-one with the arrival card, with the individual case files. So we have arrival cards for people who don't have case files on them, and vice versa. And finally, we have ship arrival and passenger lists. These documents are some of our earliest, highest Boston records, and they mostly were ledgers recording ship arrivals and the Jewish passengers on them. They give information such as passenger name, age, marital status, birthplace, and who and where they were destined to. So in this case, we see the SS Arabic arrived in Boston on February 6, 1913. And though hard to read, this is a list of its Jewish passengers. And you can see that often these immigrants weren't planning on staying in Boston. They were heading for places like Chicago, Providence, Philadelphia, and Newark, and even places like Fargo, North Dakota. So keep that in mind, that even if they weren't destined for Boston and only passed through Boston, you may find your ancestors in these records. And here we have a list of detained or deported passengers. This is an interesting case. Up here, you can see that the immigrant, Nochem Ackerman, actually came through Ellis Island in New York, and was destined there. But his father-in-law, Jay Goldberg, who lived in Boston, appealed to highest, and so he was detained there. But his father-in-law, Jay Goldberg, who lived in Boston, appealed to highest Boston for help. The ledger notes that Nochem was not allowed in the country because he had a hernia, and that highest Boston thought his chances of him being let into the country were low because of his medical condition, and also the fact that his father-in-law in Boston, who he was destined to, was very poor and only made $5 per week. In the end, the appeal that highest Boston filed was rejected, and Nochem was deported back to Europe. And this other document shows that the Omensky family aboard the Ivernia, which landed in Boston on May 11, 1906, were all deported and were sent back to Europe on the Saxonia on May 29th. So what do all these highest Boston records, the individual case files, the arrival cards, and the ship passengers lists tell you? I've talked about this already, but one thing I just want to point out again is that highest Boston records can really reveal a lot about your family's immigration story. Through things like familial correspondence, notes made by highest Boston workers, and other paperwork, you can see the process of immigration over the years, beginning from when these immigrants were either hoping to find opportunity in a new land, or when they were desperately trying to flee, and sometimes to the end, either when they were reunited with their family in the US, when we find that they were able to flee elsewhere, or when we see that they didn't survive the war. Through these files, you not only learn facts, names, dates, and places, but you can understand your family's story, and these documents can reveal what life was like for them in their homelands, what their hopes and dreams were, and so much more. So how do you access the highest Boston records? For individual case files, you can check out our DLA. Currently, we have over 7,300 case files uploaded and available, and more are being added literally every single day. Please keep in mind that we follow the 72-year rule that many archives and institutions follow. That means that we don't upload case files until 72 years after they were created. So for right now, in 2021, only case files from 1949 and earlier are available online. And in 2022, we'll add cases from 1950, and we'll continue to release more each year. For non-digitized case files, whether because they don't follow the 72-year rule or because we simply haven't gotten around to digitizing it yet, you can email us for access. So here's how to access an individual case file using the DLA. One way is that you can simply type in a name into the search bar, and you can see here I've searched for Perkins. And here are the results. We have Alexander Perkins, we have Fanny Perkins, but we also have Fanny Israel. And you may ask, why does it show Fanny Israel, who is not a Perkins? So here we can see that this case file is showing up in the results because Sophie Perkins is listed as an associated name. So looking at the document, we can see here that Sophie Perkins is in fact Fanny Israel's mother, her maiden name. This is why I encourage you all to search the DLA, because using the finding aids, this case file wouldn't show up when you search for Perkins. When digitizing and creating metadata in indexes, we are sure to add expanded metadata so you can find your relatives in case files, even if they're not the exact name on the case file. We are sure to include spelling variations. Here you can see, of course, we have Fanny Israel listed as a name, but we've also included and made searchable her maiden name, which was Fanny Damashek, and her birth name, which was actually Golda Damashek. So you may be early on in your research and you don't yet know that Fanny had married and that she took on the name Israel. You may only know her birth name, Golda Damashek. So this way, if you search for her birth name in our DLA, the case file will show up. We've also made searchable the names of her relatives, acquaintances, sponsors, and more. Arrival cards are currently not digitized. Both Jewish Gen and Ancestry have databases that have indexed and made searchable the arrival cards. They provide most of the information that is recorded on the arrival card, but you can't see the image. Currently, the arrival cards are alphabetized in 21 boxes, but because there are so many, we don't have a complete listing of the names of all 24,000 plus arrival cards. So if you think we may have an arrival card you'd like to see, email us and we'd be happy to check. And many of the ship arrivals and passenger lists are digitized and indexed and searchable through the Boston MA Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society Immigration Records database on AmericanAncestors.org. You can search by numerous criteria, including passenger name and ship name. So here's an example. You can see here that I've searched for the Omensky family. And this is the record, which includes the image from the highest Boston records. And finally, a short word about personal and family papers. As I mentioned earlier, and a point I want to reiterate, is that archival collections add historical context to family research and genealogy. We have a wide variety of personal and family papers. We have papers of immigrants from all over the world, soldiers, doctors, lawyers, politicians, philanthropists, and so much more that you can use to, even if they're not actually from your own family, understand what life may have been like for your family. Now onto newspapers, and I know we're running a little bit over time, so I will try to go through these pretty quickly. The JHC carries runs of numerous Massachusetts and New England newspapers, including the Jewish Times, and we have, which serve the Boston Jewish community, and we have records of issues from 1945 to 1992, and that they are fully digitized, searchable, and available on our DLA. And for this collection, you don't even need a guest user account to access it. We also have bound volumes of the Jewish Weekly News, which serves Western Massachusetts, as well as the Jewish Journal, which served and continues to serve the North Shore of Massachusetts. And to access these, they're not yet digitized, so email us. And finally, we can provide access to digitized and searchable issues of the Jewish Advocate, a Boston Jewish newspaper that actually just shut down this past September. This is an external database we offer, so you must be on site at the JHC and NEHGS building to access this database. So how can newspapers we offer be helpful to you and your family history research? Similar to other resources I talked about, they can provide vital information about your family through obituaries, birth and marriage announcements, school announcements, legal notices, and society happenings. And like family papers, even if you don't find mentions of your actual family, newspapers provide local, national, and international context that can really help you to understand the world your ancestors were living in. And I just wanted to show an example that this is just all from one issue of the Jewish Weekly News. And you can see here, up here, there's international news that provide context. There's obituaries, there's facts with Max, as well as town chatter, which provides all sorts of mundane yet really interesting town happenings. And lastly, we also offer access to a few databases that may be helpful for you in your research. So here's a list of the 7 databases on AmericanAncestors.org that are related to Jewish family history. I've already talked about the Rabbi Benkovitz database, as well as the highest Boston one, so let me briefly fill you in on the rest. So the Jewish Cemetery Association of Massachusetts database, which is free, so you don't need an NEHGS or JHC membership to access, lets you search for cemetery and burial records in the many cemeteries that JCAM manages. The Jewish Cemeteries of Western Massachusetts database includes similar information, but also the names of parents and spouses where known. And for this, and most of the ones I'll talk about, you do need an NEHGS or JHC membership to view. Not New England related, but we also offer the Charleston, South Carolina Jewish Cemetery database, as well as the Organized Jewish Group Activity in the 19th Century database, which contains a list of all organized Jewish groups and activities that appeared in Massachusetts during the 19th century, and where possible, things like the founding or charter date, prominent members of the organization, and more. And finally, the Sharon Memorial Park Cemetery database, which provides cemetery and burial information about one of the largest Jewish cemeteries in New England. And for this one, the database is free and you don't need a guest or paid account to use it. So to quickly review what we've talked about today, our archives, whether they be Rabbi, Synagogue, or organizational records, personal and family papers, or newspapers can help you research your own family history by providing little facts and figures, birth names, birth dates, immigration years, and more. They can tell your family's story through case files, synagogue bulletins, meeting minutes, and more. And they give context to your ancestors' worlds and daily lives. Be sure to utilize our discovery tools to help you figure out if and what collections may be useful to you in researching your family history. Using our finding aids in our DLA, you can see the full contents of our collections, and that should help you know if a collection will be useful to you. And lastly, I'm sure you've seen and understand that our collections have varying levels of searchability. Some of our collections are digitized and are searchable. Some are digitized but aren't searchable, and you have to browse through them. And some simply are just not digitized at all. So as you can see, the JHC has lots and lots and lots of resources that can help your research, you research your family history. Always feel free to email our reference email address, jhcreference@nehgs.org, for questions about our resources, how to access them, or anything else.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Lindsay, for that just kind of tip of the iceberg overlook and outline of some of the many materials that we have available at the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center. Now, before we get to everyone's questions, I am excited to announce that we are celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center here at New England Historic Genealogical Society, and we are celebrating with a very special virtual gala event. So please join us for a lively evening on Thursday, June 10th, as we honor Margot Stern-Strom with the Tzedakah Lifetime Achievement Award. Strom is the founder of the international organization Facing History and Ourselves, an organization that has inspired millions of students and teachers around the world to investigate the root causes of racism, anti-Semitism, and prejudice, and to understand the obligations of civic participation. You can learn more and register for the program by going to jewishheritagecenter.org. All right, so let's get to some questions. Go ahead and type your query into the question panel, and we'll try to answer as many as we can in the time provided. So Suzanne says, I'm already an associate member of NEHGS. What is the advantage of also joining the JHC other than donating twice to a good cause? And I think that's a really good reason. But most of the data I'm looking for would be from 1880 to 1920.
That's a good question. So we do offer a few extra benefits as specifically a JHC member. Including some one-on-one time with an archivist, but generally you do get the same access and things like that. You can become a JHC member and get all the access to NEHGS, and for the most part, vice versa.
All right, thank you. Lawrence asks, so are highest port records available prior to 1930, say 1900 to 1920? And where would they be available?
So for Boston ones, we do have case files from before the 1930s, but they're just not as prevalent. But I definitely think it'd be worth it to check if on our finding aid or on our DLA if they exist for your family, because they do exist, but they're just the vast majority of our records are from the 30s to 50s, and the arrival cards they even go back until the 1890s, so it's also possible that you can find your ancestors in the arrival cards if they immigrated from 1900 to 1920. So if that's the case, you should either look on Jewish Gen or Ancestry to see if they have an index, an arrival card for your family member, or you can simply just email us and I'm happy to go take a look.
All right. Carolyn is wondering where to look for a Jewish man who emigrated to New York in about 1700. So if you're looking for early New York records, do you have any suggestions for repositories or sources that she might turn to?
Sure. Our semi-related organization, American Jewish Historical Society in New York at the Center for Jewish History, may have some records that may help you. I believe there's also the Ackerman and Ziff Genealogy Center there as well. The Center for Jewish History houses a bunch of different archives in the same building. So if you email them, the Center for Jewish History, they can put you in touch with the right archive that may have records that you're looking for.
Now, Jackie asks an interesting question. In some of the earlier records that you showed in the presentation, the Rabbi records of marriages, it noted the bride and groom's race as white. Jackie asks, why was that information included? Any idea?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know, and I haven't seen a race listed in those ledgers that isn't white. So I honestly don't know. It's really interesting and something that I and other people have noted that is interesting that it's included. But yes, to answer the question, we really don't know.
And I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about donating materials to the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center. Are we actively looking for collections? What type of collections, and how might you go about making a materials donation to our collections?
Sure. So we are actively looking, and I want to note that some people don't necessarily think that their family's papers may be something that we would want because they might just be ordinary Jewish citizens in Boston, but we do. As you may have seen, we have the papers of all sorts of quote unquote ordinary citizens, and they are some of our favorite papers. And they, while maybe not being the most prominent of citizens, they provide wonderful research to people all over. So we are actively looking. Family papers, business records. We are trying to amp up our business records collections. Organizational records, really everything. So if you are interested, you should email us at jhcreference@nehgs.org, and either I or my colleague Stephanie Call will be in touch with you.
All right. Well, I think those are just about all of the questions, but thank you again so much, Lindsay, for your fantastic presentation. As I noted at the start of today's event, we did record this event, this presentation, and we will shortly be posting it to our website and YouTube channel, so stay tuned for that if you want to review any of the material that we discussed. And if we didn't get to your question, you can certainly reach us at jhcreference@nehgs.org, and again, I will include that in my follow-up email to you. But you may also consider chatting with a genealogist, especially on some of the details, or if you have reference questions. Where should I turn to? Is there a book that talks about this? Those types of questions, you can reach our genealogists Monday through Saturday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Time by going to americanancestors.org/chat. So I want to thank you again for joining us. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create others for you and other audiences around the world. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center, americanancestors.org/education. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.